So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're making a few last minute adjustments to the sound system. I'm Chris Teutsch. I'm the forage extension specialist at the University of Kentucky. I'm located all the way in the western part of the state at the Princeton Research Station. Many of you probably know several years ago we were hit by a tornado, and we're just now moving into our new building in March. So we're pretty excited about it. The tornado destroyed about every building on the research station except for about a half a dozen, 39 structures. So our research station's brand new is the good news. The bad news is we've been in a trailer for 4 years, so we're going to be pretty happy to get out of that trailer. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 100% grass-fed cattle farmer panel, and we've got 3 outstanding grass-fed producers that will be telling you about their operation today. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And Linnell is going to tell us how we're going to collect the questions and get those answered.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm Linnell Rivera Rodriguez. I'm a Research and Extension Associate here at Kentucky State in the organic program. So since we only have one mic and this session is being recorded, we're going to ask you, there's going to be a QR code in the screen in the back for Slido, which is an app that you don't have to download the app, you just scan the code. Write your questions. You can vote around the room which question you want Chris to ask our panel, and that's the question he'll ask. While the presentation is going, I'm going to have around for you this little sheet of paper. This is our session feedback. It's really important for OG for you to tell us to know what you liked about this, what you liked to be in the next session. So please fill this out. You can leave it on the table and I'll pick it up at the end of this session. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you.
Okay, I've never used this app before, so we'll see how that goes. Linnell is my technical support. And we're going to go ahead and get started. And what we wanted to do first was let each one of our panelists take about 10 minutes and tell you about their farms, about their operations, and then you can start to formulate questions and enter them into the app. And then we'll start the discussion after we get through all 3 of our panelists. So it's my pleasure to introduce. We'll just go ladies first. What if we don't have, who doesn't have a phone with them? No, we will make accommodations for people that don't know how to use their phones or who don't have their phones with them. So if you have a question, we'll get the question, we'll make sure that we repeat it so it's on the recording, and then we'll get that discussion started from there. Okay? All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, and that's Debbie Brann. Debbie Brann has a farm in Adolphus, Kentucky, and I don't want to give you any background on Debbie. I'll let her give the background on her operation, but it's been a true pleasure working with her and Greg for the last several years on their annual pasture walk. It's always the highlight of my year. So Debbie.
Hello. So yeah, I farm in Adolphus and have about 1,000 acres total, what we own and rent. And I think I'd like to say right at the beginning, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Mac and Steve. In the very, very early days, I was here learning about organic farming in the 90s, so in early 2000s. So thank you. So we do 100% grass-fed dairy, beef, and lamb on our farm. We sell everything at the farmer's market, 1 steak at a time. We butcher 5 to 7 steers every 3 weeks, and same amount of lambs every 3 weeks. We do about 6,000 birds on our farm, chickens, and layers. We do wool, I have cashmere goats, and bees. We do a little bit of everything. But our dairy we've had since, I guess we're going on about 30 years having our grass-fed dairy. And we have been grass-fed since probably 1994, I think, is when we decided to get all of our ruminants off grain. And back then, there was no internet. At least I didn't have it. And so I got a couple of books from 1906 to try to learn how to actually do this, how to get my animals off of grain. People told me they would die, and they didn't. I was super thankful for that. But yeah, so we do 2 farmers markets, one in Franklin, Tennessee, and one in Bowling Green. And everything from the farm goes out through those two markets. We rotational graze, regenerative. We're stocked at about 2.8 animal units per acre, and yeah, I think that's a good introduction. That's kind of what we do. Pass it on.
Okay. Our next. Can I borrow that one? I'll just introduce you real quick. So our next. This one's not working either. Okay, our next speaker is John Bell, and you had a nice introduction. Congratulations on your award, well deserved. And let's give him a hand. And this is kind of a neat story, and I hope you'll tell us a little bit more about your story, John. But this is a 6th-generation farm, and they've really changed from what I would say would be the antithesis of organic, which would be tobacco production, to organic, fully certified farm, and that's a pretty amazing switch. And I'm going to turn it over to John and let him give you a little bit of background on his farm.
Thank you, Chris. Side note real quick, Chris mentioned a tornado. During the earlier session, Brooke was talking about the history of oak. My sister Ann reminded me the very first oak session, the very first oak conference was at Western Kentucky at the sales arena, show arena, barn type place. And during that first conference, there was a tornado warning that went off, and all of us participants had to like huddle in the little sales arena down at the bottom of it. It's a nice cozy start to the whole thing. But thanks, it's an honor to be here. And real quick about our farm. So Elmwood Stock Farm, my sister and I grew up there on the farm, traditional cattle and tobacco farm. Probably saw the handwriting on the wall with tobacco at a young age. And so as we got out of college and came back to the farm, before then, while we were in high school and college, we started diversifying into vegetables, primarily wholesale and then some farmers markets. Then, hello, there we go. Yep. Then, as we got out of college, the same farm, the same footprint had to kind of support 3 families instead of 1, and so that's when we made the decision to instead of increasing acreage, we increased enterprises, and so we went retail, steered away from wholesale, and started focusing primarily on many different enterprises and selling retail primarily to our community. So to this day, probably 90% of our sales are generated and delivered within 70 miles, an hour drive of the farm. It's roughly 400 acres. The size has varied a little bit over the years because we lost some rented land, but we're at 400 acres, certified organic since 99, I believe, 1999. And then one of the benefits, the transition to organic wasn't super difficult because of the rotation system that my grandfather and father had always schooled us in, which was we had a cattle tobacco rotation that became a livestock and vegetable crop rotation. So we basically just substituted the cash crops from tobacco to vegetables. But that rotation is the whole soil building program that before we were organic, we still were doing that on the farm. That's what we were taught. But that made the transition to organic not super difficult. There's a lot of input substitution when you try to switch to organic farming. And but ultimately, usually what determines the success of an organic farm is its long-term fertility plan, because it's hard to replace a few tons of ammonium nitrate with 10 tons or 100 tons of feather meal, something like that. So it's more of a philosophical switch for your fertility plan. Since we used livestock to build the soil to turn around and mine it with a cash crop every few years, that fundamental never changed, and I credit that with the success of the longevity. I'm still not going to say success, but we're still doing it all these years later. But the longevity of our farm is because it was built off of a sound fundamental fertility program. And so today I would say we're still a fairly low input farm using rotational livestock, which is primarily cattle, but also sheep, poultry, pigs. All of those rotate around the farm. That allows us to, using the proteins generated by the livestock allows us to generate a few $100s per acre on income when it's in the livestock part of the rotation. The soil builds up in fertility and nutrients, and then we turn it under, plow it, till it, do a cash crop for a few years to generate a few $1,000s an acre. So that's the primary and the majority of our fertility program, and that makes it fairly sustainable or regenerative. Most of our fertility is just mineral balancing. We're high phosphorus soil, so it's primarily sulfate of potash and lime every 4, 5, 6 years is kind of the primary nutrients we have to bring on. A few crops do get some nitrogen supplement. A few crops will get occasionally sulfur or copper or something like that, micronutrients. So that's the introduction to the farm. It's roughly 400 acres. We probably can crop just under half that, like 180 acres is flat enough to be tillable and croppable. We run about 50 cows and 50 mama ewes and a little bit more, a couple hundred laying hens, probably finish around 20 or 30 to 40, depends on the year, pigs on the farm. Have 3 sows right now. We have 25 roughly breeder stock in turkeys, and we'll take to the butcher roughly 200 to 300 turkeys every year, 350, something like that. Broilers, laying hens. The rotation, the way I look at it is the ruminants, which is the cattle and the sheep are the primary soil builders because they can turn a forage into dollars. We grow grain. We also buy in grain to supplement the pastured poultry and the pastured pork. But they are all eating grass and eating insects or worms or snakes or whatever they can find out there. But they are getting supplemented with grain. So we still look at the grain as being a nutrient coming in, whether we're moving it from one field to the other or we're buying it, bringing it on the farm. So it's still important where we're feeding those animals because we're looking at that grain or we don't buy hay, but if we did, we look at it as you're buying a feed source, but you're also bringing in a fertility source. And so we're selective we try to do a lot of that feeding on our cropland so we can mine those nutrients eventually and cash them in on a cash crop. So our fertility, our livestock, the rotation that we're here to talk about today is the major component of that is our soil building program or fertility program for the farm. And those ruminants can do that. Then Debbie mentioned stocking rate. So I figure for our cows, roughly, so we're a cow-calf to finishing animals, and we finish somewhere around 24 to 26 months of age is what our target is. Sometimes it's 22, sometimes it's 28, but we're trying to do right around 2 years of age. A little bit, 26 months is ideal, what I'm shooting for. With that said, we're roughly 4 acres per cow. So you have a cow, her calf its side, and her weanling or yearling that's a finishing animal. So we figure we can birth, grow, and have a finished animal per 4 acres. It's a closed herd. We do some AI, but it's been a closed herd for, 30 or 40 years since the last purchase. Probably a show animal was probably the last purchased animal that came onto the farm. That's enough. I've gone on long enough. Here you go, Derek. Well.
All right. Our last panelist is Derek Lawson. And Derek is the beef cow manager at Foxhollow Farm, and we had the pleasure of doing a regional beef field day there this last summer. So really enjoyed that, Derek, and I'm glad you're on the panel today.
Yeah, so my name's Derek Lawson. I'm the farm manager for Foxhollow. We're in Crestwood, Kentucky. We're 100% grass-fed and finished beef and lamb operation. So the farm is 1,300 acres, but about 400 of that's woods. So we have 750 acres in pasture. Right now we're running, so we had 125 calves born last year, and then the yearlings and finishers and all that. So we, at our peak, which is the last day of calving, is June 1st. So this year we were at 450 head on that. We kind of have a standing processing date every 2 weeks. We take 5 head. So we do about 110 to 125 head of beef a year that we direct market through our on-farm store, subscription, regional shipping, and subscriptions. A few restaurants as well. Made a big shift away from the wholesale and restaurants right ahead of COVID. So we were set up for freezer beef and all that stuff right when all that hit. We're also, right now, we're running about 100 hair sheep on the farm, and we're kind of using them for, to have an extra species on the farm for some diversity, but we graze a lot of the unfenced areas with the sheep. They're using them to help control some invasives and some other stuff like that. And we sell a few sheep through our market, but we're marketing a lot of ours through Brewer Livestock in Indiana right now. I think we did 50 through there this year. So we are a certified biodynamic farm, and we have been since 2013, I think, was when we got our first certification on that. And then this year we got our Regenified certification. So we're certified regenerative through Regenified. Trying to think. It's kind of the basics of what we're doing. You know, it's we split our herd during the spring to help maintain grass in the vegetative state or whatever, and then usually after calving is finished, we'll put it all together in one big mob. So we'll have our cows, calves, and our yearlings, and then we have our finishers running separate for most of the year, just because we have such a frequency that we have to get them up and sort. We did finish in the mob for a couple of years, but once that group got to a certain size, it became too difficult to get that many. I mean, you get 400 head up to sort 5 out every 2 weeks is a bit of a struggle. So we kind of separate them off, and they have their own little rotation. And then to try to make sure that we're not grazing the same class of livestock in the same place year after year, we'll shift that rotation around. But they kind of stay close to a sorting facility, and the cows and the yearlings will flip back and forth. So one year we'll calve on the south side of the road, and then the next year we'll calve on the north side of the road. We're split by a highway. We get to do a little cattle drive every once in a while, shut down the highway and run cows across the highway. We did that last week in the snow. We ran 355 head across the road in less than 10 minutes. So that's kind of the basics of what we're doing. I could keep you here all day, but I just kind of...
So what we'd like to do now, can you all hear me okay with this microphone? Okay. So what we'd like to do now is kind of open it up for questions and discussion. And Linnell, you're going to have to browbeat some people in to put some questions into the app, because I've only got one in here so far. So I'll start out and ask just a couple basic questions to kind of get things rolling. And the first one is about weather patterns. Everybody in this room knows we've had some erratic weather patterns in the last several years with drought and then excessive rainfall. And I'd like to know how each of you kind of managed through those erratic weather patterns. You want to start, Derek, and then pass the microphone down this way?
Yeah. So the big thing that we've had the last couple years is a very dry fall, which makes it hard to stockpile grass. And actually, this year we tried something that I learned from Greg Brann, where we locked the cows in an 80-acre area and fed them hay for September and October. And that rested over 80% of the rest of the grazable pasture. So we were able to stockpile that. So once the killing frost hit, we started rotating the cows through that stockpiled grass, and we have about 2 weeks of that stockpile left right now. So there were several fields that were able to rest for 5 months between the last time we grazed them and then when we came through. And we were, I mean, that group that we were, the main group we were grazing the stockpile with is 355 head of cows, calves, and yearlings. And, you know, in the first few fields that had 5 months worth of rest, you know, we had 38 inches worth of fescue. We measured it all, and so we were able to graze, strip graze. We give them a section a day without back fencing behind it. So that group would be on 18 to 20 acres for about 10 days. So it was about 2 acres a day that they were getting. 1.8 acres to 2 acres a day of stockpile is what we were able to do. But that's the big shift for us with the weather pattern, is not being able to stockpile that fall grass, and then making the shift of feeding hay when it's nicer and you're not driving through mud, and you can just go out and set some poly wire when it's kind of muddy and nasty and you're not having to worry about taking a tractor out to unroll hay, because all the hay that we do feed, we unroll it, so that helps fertility.
So I'm going to answer this on what we do some and what we intend to do, but this doesn't always happen. We try to finish our cattle to a choice grade. We have, every time we go to the butcher, we have them graded, and because we're trying to. Years ago, it was grain on grass, so our cattle have always been on pasture, but we had a creep feeder out there. And when I approached my dad about trying to grass finish, he said, "Sure, John, you're welcome to, as long as there's no compromise in the quality." So I had to learn how to finish an animal on grass, but still maintain the marbling that had always been important to him. In the service, he'd eaten some pretty tough grass-fed meat from South America while he was in the service, and so he had a strong bias against grass-fed meat. And he would not allow, you know, he was always very much a marbling kind of guy, and he would not allow us to compromise that. So the part of the key that we found, you know, it's genetics and several different factors to try to finish an animal on grass well. But a key component of that is a series of annuals, summer annuals and winter annuals. There's certain times a year where perennial forages are harder to finish an animal well on, so you can use an annual to do that, higher energy. All that to say is, as we've had more varied weather patterns, we're relying more and more on annuals as part of that stockpile process. Because, again, if you plant an annual in a drought, it's not going to grow any more than a perennial. But when you do have a successful annual crop, at least for me, I'm able to stockpile more pounds per acre from a cereal than my perennial pastures. And so that, Chris, has been, we've in theory and sometimes in practice, we're trying to up our annual game to help mitigate basically to have more store feed, whether it's in a roll or in a standing pasture.
I think with us, we had the exact same situation, just these dry falls that have really hurt. And then all the rain, we've got several creeks through our farm, and so it's always, when we see the rain coming, we got to get our animals to the right pastures so that we don't have to cross a creek to rotate. We've also introduced Mashonas. We've bought a couple of Mashona bulls to help maybe, as we're seeing more of these drought patterns, they're lot more water efficient cattle. So far we're pretty happy with them. And I'll explain Greg's technique too, because it is, every time he mentions this, I see puzzled looks, but rather than feeding all of our hay when we can't grow grass, we feed our hay when we can grow grass. So Greg has figured that we can grow 1.5 times the forage in when we have some rain in the fall, which is super great. So we're using less hay than we would be forage. And so every September, as we watch what is the weather pattern for this year, we'll go ahead and lock them up and start feeding hay.
So great answers, and that's something everybody's going to have to deal with as we move forward, is these highly fluctuating weather patterns. It seems that we go from feast to famine, and that has a big impact on not only productivity but also forage quality, which is extremely important for grass finishing animals. I had a good friend in Virginia, and he said that you can have a great story behind your product and behind your farm, but at the end of the day, you've got to have a good quality good quality product, or people are not going to come back. And that's really important, I think. All right, our top question right now is, what forage types are you using to finish your livestock on? And we talked a little bit about that. John, Debbie, do you want to talk a little bit about what your forage base is and how you're maintaining forage quality during that finishing process?
I'm not going to talk that much about this because I'm super interested to hear what John says about the annuals, because Greg and I are I'm the money person on our farm, so I never want to spend that money. It always seems like a risk with crazy weather patterns of like, if I'm going to put all this money into it. So we just, we have a lot of orchard grass, a lot of fescue, but our pastures are very, very diversified. And we haven't really had any trouble because I'm married to a grazing specialist, so that helps. But we're very interested in, because I told Greg about this, about finishing on annuals. So I'm interested to hear that too.
Okay, thanks. So spring to midsummer, our perennial grass, clover pasture that we kind of naturally have is really good at finishing. So we don't do a lot of annuals in the spring. We do annuals in the springtime as part of our soil building program, but it's not necessarily part of our finishing program necessarily. Forage-wise or finishing an animal-wise, we found that perennial pastures, spring and early summer, work pretty well. But having a summer annual to graze in the fall side, because that's when your perennial pastures are trying to go to seed. That's when they're storing their carbohydrates or their energy in the roots to get ready for winter time. So just like spring or summer, early summer hay is higher quality feed value often than fall hay, your forages are the same way. And so you need a high energy forage. An annual is a high energy forage that you can graze in the late summer and fall and to keep fattening cattle. What I call free, cheap, easy one, if you are growing any grain, is corn and soybeans. So we'll just mix that in a grain drill and throw it out there. Because I got it in the bin, so it's kind of free to me because it doesn't take too many pounds. I'm not robbing much out of my grain bin. So corn is a grass until it starts to make an ear. And so it's also high yielding. It's the whatever the carbon thing, C4s. So it's super high energy, super fast growing, a really great utilizer of sunlight to grow fast. So that's the cheap, free, easy one off the farm. And then there's, summer soybeans and millet is what my dad used to always sow. And so now, some of the brown rib millets and we have a lot of Johnson grass, and that's frankly it's a good finishing grass in the summertime. With that said, I don't plant a lot of Sudex or Sudan grass, which is high yielding, because I already have Johnson grass, which is darn near the same thing, and then I plant corn, which also grows pretty fast. So when we're buying seed to plant in the summertime, A lot of times the primary grass will be a millet because I'm wanting something a little more leafy and palatable compared to, because I've already got, if I want something faster growing, I have the Johnson grass or the corn to go to. We'll mix in, you know, sun hemp and buckwheat, and we'll mix in a lot of variety in there for the diversity and the soil building side, but frankly, it's a summer pea or a bean and a grass is the bulk of the forage that the cattle are eating. So we have the diversity, and I'm sure it's good for them, but we're getting the tons from those grasses. Our winter cover crop mix is primarily like a rye and a radish and crimson clover to some degree. I like purple top vetch a lot, but frankly, Austrian winter peas are usually cheaper. So when I'm buying our primary cover crop in winter would be rye, Austrian winter pea, and radish, and then we'll add a few other things in there. That's for roll down roller crimping in the springtime, plowing under in the springtime grazing as well. So those are all winter annuals. The cattle do well on that, but primarily they're fattening on the rye, I feel like, because that's the grass. It's the high energy grass. The legumes and other things are there to add diversity or to add nitrogen to it. But so rye is my cover crop of choice in the wintertime. Cattle graze it fine. Where I'm still struggling is a standing dead summer annual grazed in December versus fresh, soft ground with oats or rye in December or January that can quickly get mucked up. So that's when the green forage of a winter annual is great grazing, but all these, unlike right now, we're seldom frozen this long. And so quite often, you know, as you all know, at least our experience is, we seldom have an extended frozen period. And so you can quickly muck up a field if it's pretty soft with a fresh summer or winter cover crop in it. So that's the fine line, as we try to have a little bit of that to give slices when the weather permits, when it's either dry or frozen, and then have some stockpiled fall perennial pasture that we give to the finishers, and then they always have fresh hay in front of them. When we try to always have the best hay in front of our finishing animals. So in general, or in theory, a great high quality dry hay on top of a oat ryegrass in January or February is going to be great finishing ration, and we've had success with that, but it takes a whole lot of stockpiling to finish 10, 20, 30 head in January, February, March on that, because it's not regrowing, or it's really growing pretty slowly. So we finish some in January, and then we'll have a butcher date in January, and then we move on until maybe March or April. I try to put it off as long as I can, just because I can't grow a whole lot of annuals. I grow it, it's sitting there in storage because it's, you know, wintertime and the days are short, and we graze it off, but it doesn't come back until late March or April. So we're more limited in our dry matter that we can graze in the winter.
Before I start, I actually have a couple questions. So is that cereal rye or ryegrass that you typically use?
Okay, cereal rye is what I'm talking about, because that's the high yielding, high growing, fast cover crop. So this is me grazing my soil building cover crop, and I'm wanting to grow as much biomass as I can. Annual ryegrass, and white clover is a great finishing ration. So if you're just focusing on finishing animals, that's like your tons per acre aren't as high, blah, blah, blah. But to answer your question, annual ryegrass is a great finishing feed.
And when you're grazing the corn, do you ever see any loss of gains or anything like that when they come out of the corn? Because I know when I was in college, we did a couple different grazing studies. And when the cattle, they were stalkers. When they came out of the corn, it didn't matter what other forage we put them on, they would go backwards a little bit. But with some of the other summer annuals that are in that same family, like the Sudex grasses and Johnson grass and stuff like that, they were gaining roughly the same weight, but they could move on to something else and not go backwards.
So I'm not that technical to know. I wasn't weighing all the things. In general, we're grazing corn and going to the butcher, but clearly that finishing group, some of them, they all don't make the trip to the butcher, so some of them would have transitioned from corn back into the fall grazing, and I very well probably ignored the drop in performance, but I didn't weigh them weekly, you know, I can't verify it, and I probably did see it and try to look the other way. Good.
So for us, we're mostly perennial pastures that were established in 2006 when we moved from a conventional row crop operation into the existing Foxhollow, the grass-fed and finished. Initially, a lot of those pastures were planted in alfalfa and orchard grass because that's what grass-fed and finished book says to do. It's the best yields and all that. But as we found out that in Kentucky 31 will take over, especially in fields that are wintered hard. So like some of the first fields that were fenced, where the cattle would overwinter up close to pressurized water and hay feeding abilities and stuff like that. Those were the first fields that we lost the alfalfa and stuff in. We have a few natives coming in here and there, and when we were doing our fall festival, we would plant a 3-acre corn maze that was actually Sudan grass. And then as soon as the corn maze was finished and the festival was over, we'd strip graze it with our finishers. It's like Sudex is, you know, a brown midrib, you know, you're getting 2 to 5 pounds a day gain off of it, depending on what stage it is, which this tended to be a bit more mature because we wanted it nice and tall for the corn maze, but so they were closer to that too. But and if by chance there was a fear that we'd get frost before we'd get through it, we have the ability to put up haylage. So we'd go in and we'd cut it and we'd wrap it for haylage. That way we don't have to worry about the prussic acid poisoning from the frost, and then we'd be able to feed it back to them later. And typically we'll buy in a little bit of alfalfa haylage from a guy in southern Indiana for the last part of the winter with our finishers. But they're typically grazing and trying to renovate the pastures that we have without a lot of extra interseeding. Although I have definitely seen the benefits of all the annuals and the different gains. It's like when I was at Murray State, we did that every single year. We had 12 acres, and depending on the class of cattle that we could get a hold of, we had that in Marshall ryegrass and stuff, and that's what they would start on, and we'd strip graze it with those animals, and as soon as they came out of a section, we'd work it up and replant it, and we'd weigh them as they would change varieties, so we knew exactly what they were getting. But it would definitely make a difference in finishing quality, for sure. It's just time and weather and finances and fertility and all those fun things that we haven't necessarily had the time to nail it down and work it out, but something I've looked at for sure.
I think it's a good point. I just want to say that part of what allows us to graze these annuals is we do have this crop ground that's going back into pasture or going back. We're trying to go back into that forage stage to rebuild, so we're going to be planting something anyway. In the past, we used annuals as a transition to a perennial pasture. What I'm playing around with now, more from a long-term weed control approach, is a series of annuals. So I'm kind of like green, stale seed bedding and building the soil. We have kind of a tried and true method of crop ground back into perennial pasture for 4 or 5 years, and the nutrients and the carbon and the organic matter and the biology is all building back up. What we're playing with is, instead of perennials, series of annuals, higher yielding but more destructive. You know, we're doing more planting, more destruction, but we're also building more biomass, growing faster, more tons per acre. But that allows us these opportunities to do these annuals that would be a bigger push if you had a perennial farm, only livestock. That's a pretty big investment and destructive process to put annuals. I completely acknowledge that.
All right, I think we'll go to the audience real quick. Is there anybody in the audience that does not have a phone or the ability to use a phone that would like to ask a question? Greg?
So John touched on this, but on average, you know, how old are
So let me repeat the question for you answer, Debbie. So Greg asked, on average, how old are the animals when they finish, and what are your average harvest weights? Is that right, Greg?
Yeah, if you do steers and heifers.
If you do steers and heifers. Okay. All right, Debbie?
Yeah, our farm, so before I moved to the farm with Greg, he was trying to get a smaller frame and just taking them to the livestock auction. And so it's been a few years now, we're trying to get a bigger frame, but not huge. And so we're really playing a lot with that right now. Ours are about between 22 and 26 months, something like that, and they're about 900 to 1,000 pounds. And no, live weight.
Live weight.
Yeah. I'm at about 58%, something like that. 55 to 58%, depending on the animal. Yep, something like that. Yeah, so I butchered some of yours, Greg, and that was a really interesting experiment, seeing, because yours one was 1,700 pounds. They're like super big. So 14 to 17, yes. And that, I keep a spreadsheet on everything I butcher, figuring out exactly how much it's costing, but more than that percentage, what I'm getting in actual meat. And we call pretty hard, so we're doing both steers and heifers.
So our herd is roughly, it's primarily Angus Wagyu cross. That was introduced years ago to try to help on the marbling side. We give up a little bit of yield grade, I feel, from that. Where our cow size is roughly 1,050, 1,100 pound cows. We are finishing at 20, again, I'm shooting for 26, 27, 28 months. It's an efficiency thing. I don't want to get too far down the road, but I've found we're trying to grade choice and happy to have prime, and we do occasionally get prime, which is pretty unique. Prime off of grass finished program is tough to get, and so, but that's our goal. I have found that with age, they can have more time to put on fat, but I feel like as they get older, especially with the Wagyu genetics, I think it's within their genetics to just finish at an older age. And so I've found it's easier to grade higher if I don't do it before 24, 26, 28 months. So I'm kind of doing that based on, with that comes a little bit of increase in carcass weight and everything else, but I'm intentionally not, whenever I start getting behind on meat supply, so I take my animals to the butcher a little bit before, like 22 months, 23 months, 20 months. I don't grade prime, and choice, it's low choice. And it's not just the finish. I'm convinced, at least with my herd, that a little bit of it is just they're gonna put on marbling as they get older. And then, so anyway, that's a long answer, but cows are 1,100 pounds roughly. The steers are roughly 1,050. The heifers are 950, something like that, is roughly their weight when I'm taking them to the butcher. I don't know the carcass weights, but and of course this all depends on our cut sheet, correct? But we're bringing home to sell roughly 38% of our live weight. I like to say it was 40%. Probably had one that did it one time, and I'm hanging my hat on 40%. But the sales department on the other side, my sister keeps telling me, we ain't doing that. So I think it's more like roughly you can pencil in 38% of a live weight is hopefully what you have to sell. And again, that's bone in, bone out makes a big difference. But we do a few bone ins, but a lot of it's boneless. Does that cover most of it?
So I've kind of been trying to build a crossbred herd that functions on that farm. and performs. So the meat sales is almost a byproduct of developing the herd and rejuvenating farmed out ground. So we have a wide variety of genetics. I have everything from Corriente, Red Angus, Black Angus. There's Barzona. Oh gosh, what else do we have? Jersey. Yeah, we've got some Jersey in there. We had a really nice Red Angus terminal line, but their maternal traits were not very good at all. So we brought in some Jerseys. So a big chunk of our brood cow herd is half Jersey right now, and we've got a little bit too much on the dairy side, like starting to show a lot more dairy characteristics to it. So in 2024 we brought in some South Poles. Happy with the calf crop. We haven't processed any of those yet. That'll be coming up this year, so we'll be able to figure out where they're at on how they yield out. But so depending on genetics, I took a mud fat Corriente heifer that weighed 675 pounds live weight. But then when you get into some of the more Angus genetics, some of our steers will be up to 1,300 pounds. And traditionally we have, across the genetics, from live to hanging weight is in that 55 to 60%. And then packaged meat bounces between 35 and, if you, like you, hang that hat on those ones that hit 40, you know. And we don't do hardly any bone-in cuts on that. So, and then we're trying to shape this herd so we have a very tight calving window. We expose all of our young heifers, our yearling heifers get exposed for 45 days. So our cattle tend, now that the herd got a little bit bigger, and we just start on that finished group, and then as they finish, we pull them out. So on the beginning side, and in the past, I think the earliest we'd ever processed was 20 months, and I think they needed a little bit more time. But so right now, the last 2 years, we've kind of been starting at 24 months because we've had enough head to kind of space over, you know, and not go a month without processing or whatever. And then we just work on that group until they're all gone. So like right now, we've got some that, I think we've got 25 head left out of that group. So they're going to be just shy of 3 by the time that group's finished. But that next group will come in just shy of 2, or right at 2. So.
All right.
Get you?
So thank you for your question, Greg. So I think this will lead right into the next question, and you talked quite a bit about it, but what breeds are you using to produce the best quality grass-finished beef and optimize marbling? So do you want to add any more to your breed discussion?
Yeah, so the Corrientes were really interesting to me. I don't know if you guys have ever seen a Corriente cow. Ours were all black. You know, their horns are, each one's as long as my arm. But they do really good when you breed them. No matter what you breed them to, I've always seen them spit out a 50 to a 55-pound calf. If you're breeding them to a polled animal, the first generation will be polled. You can knock the horns off of them genetically. I know guys that are putting Charolais bulls on Corriente cows and not having to pull a single calf. They come out mouse gray, no horns, and gain like a Charolais. So that was kind of the inspiration when we were growing the herd to try to do that. And we used the Red Angus on them first, because that's what the bulls that we were using. And I've got a picture on my computer. It was the second week of October, and there was a calf that was born April 1st, standing next to its Corriente mom, and all you can see is her horns. It's the exact same size as her at 6 months. So you've got 8 months bred cows that were weighing 800 pounds at the most that are weaning 500 pound plus calves at 10 months when we were weaning them. And then they gained really well. So, but then right now we're just trying to play with something that can work with our management, and our main goal right now is working on soil health and building our forage base with the cattle and what's there. And then also looking at how they're coming out on the rail and tweaking that, so we know like there's certain bloodlines that'll have more connective tissue, and we're like, okay, well, she bred back, but we don't really want to have to mechanically tenderize all these one steaks or whatever, processing wise. So we start paying attention to that kind of stuff and pulling those lines out, or maybe trying to keep a few more heifers, give a second chance to something that maybe didn't breed in that 45-day window. And we're all spring calving just for ease of management, not having to have a spring calving herd and a fall calving herd with different nutrition demands at different points of the year, just to kind of simplify the management and the rotation for that.
Already mentioned primarily Angus Wagyu. We started with an Angus herd. I like using the Angus as the foundation. It's got the most extensive EPDs in terms of when you're selecting breeding stock. You can look for back fat versus marbling, energy, calving ease. So applaud Angus industry for the EPDs that they have. There was also, for a while, I think it was ABS Sires did actual live animal slaughter tenderness testing and stuff. And so I found a lot of value in selecting for some tenderness tenderness confirmed bulls that ABS used to carry. Now it's based primarily on DNA markers, which is better than nothing, I guess, but I think the verified from slaughtering animals was way better. So that's a lot of our fundamental, at this point, Angus goes back to 2 or 3 bulls that I had been using several years ago from ABS that had the tenderness that I had selected partly for the overall no extreme traits, but they were pretty high in consistently tender cuts. So again, I guess you could say back when I showed cattle, I was looking at something completely different, but now that we're selling a steak to a person that we're going to see again, hopefully next week at the farmer's market, priorities have completely changed. So the things I select for is marbling and tenderness in terms of paper or genetics. And then on the ground, I'm looking for, keeping calves, heifers out of cows that have been in the herd for a long time and calved every year. I'm letting the environment or my management or who works well with my management select the replacement animals. But the genetics and the forage are the way we try to get high grades on grass.
When I very first started in the 90s, I started with Scottish Highlands. Talk about I felt like to sell beef, I was going to have to get in magazines and stuff, so that's why I started with them. But and they took 4 years to get to a good weight. Now we have just a very wide variety. We have Red Angus, we have South Pole, we have the Mashonas, we have British Whites, which I love. Those always come in like around 62% when I butcher the British Whites. And so we have Mashonas and South Pole bulls. And in the 90s, when I very first started, my beef was hard to swallow. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, just took everybody off grain. And but for about 10 years, I didn't have a single customer that wasn't sick. Every single customer I had cancer, lupus, Crohn's disease, something. So they were super thankful, and they were like just slow cooking everything that they bought from me. I mean, probably even the fillets needed to be sous vide if we had sous vide back then. But so it's super interesting to hear, how far we've come. Because back then, we never ever thought somebody would lie about having grass-fed beef because nobody wanted it back then, and I'm probably one of the reasons why. But yeah, I think the Corrientes are super interesting. Like, I think every year Greg and I talk about those, and especially we had about 200 acres that came out of a CREP program that hadn't been grazed in 15 years. And when we took that out, I mean, it looked like the surface of the moon. Once all the weeds were grazed, and we talked about corrientes then because they do so well on that kind of pasture. Yeah, I mentioned the Moshonas and bringing those in, and we've tried the South Poles. I think are going to be interesting to see what happens. We're pretty impressed with the Moshonas and what we're getting out of that. Not pulling any calves, of course, and the marbling we're pretty happy with so far.
All right. Great answers. I'll just add, I had a good friend in Virginia that was probably one of the best grass finishers that I've ever had the experience of working with. He used a forage that was not mentioned by this group, but it was crabgrass and annual ryegrass rotation, and that was a really high-quality forage. One thing that Garth did with every carcass was they cooked a steak out of it, and him and his family sat around and ate that steak. And that's how they knew that they had a good quality product, and that was really important to him. He was marketing to some really high-end markets in Yorktown and Williamsburg, Virginia. So having a high-quality product was extremely important, and I'm glad you mentioned that and admitted that sometimes your beef was a little bit tough, Debbie.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to our next highest rated question. And it's about processing. It says, who are you working with for processing? What are the successes and challenges? For direct marketing, how do you decide between smaller cuts / larger roasts and sausages? So you want to start, Debbie? I think that's a great question for you.
Yeah. So on processing, we use Boone's in Bardstown, and we set out our dates a year and a half in advance, just every 3 weeks. We've been caught before with not being able to have those dates, so that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. So they've been fantastic to work with, and I think that sticking with a processor is super important because you do set up that relationship. When COVID hit, our butcher got rid of their bottom 25% of all their customers. Anybody that had given them a hard time, they just dropped them. So every email I send is like, thank you for all you do for us. And let's see, what are the successes and challenges? We've tried several different processors. We'll get somebody a little bit closer to us and we'll send a steer there, and we've just never really been happy. I think the processors that have been there and really know what they're doing, that's who we're going to stick with, just because I need to. If I was just doing this for a hobby, I think I'd try more smaller processors.
How about cut size, Debbie?
Yeah. Our goal, is definitely to sell everything off the animal. So we keep a pretty good inventory, and we try not to do a whole lot of different cuts. Everything is cut 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick, and the smaller, just knowing what you sell. I know we've talked about doing sort of what Foxhollow does, where you just break it up and sell it in boxes and farm boxes. And so far, I think, since we've been doing this for so long, we really know what our customers want. And so we try to not have anything left over.
Do you ever get stuck with a certain cut of meat or a ground beef or anything?
No, we don't. I'm super thankful for that. And I think it's just knowing what our customers want. Also, our customers have been with us for so long. We've been at the same farmer's market for 17 years. And so most of our customers are like, oh, you don't have a fillet? I'll take this. But fillets, number one, when we butcher 5 animals, we sell out of fillets in the first week to 2 weeks. And then liver is our next biggest seller.
Do you do any, can I ask one more question? Do you do any value-added marketing from pieces like for pets or any
We do
the other
pet
one?
food. Chicken is our pet food. So we take all of the scraps, the innards, and the bones, and we turn that into pet food.
Okay. So, same question. Let me read it again because it was a pretty long question. It was about processing. Who are you working with for processing? What are your successes and challenges? And then for direct marketing, what size of cuts, larger or smaller, do you use?
Okay, so we go to Central Kentucky Custom Meats in Casey County outside of Liberty. Jerome has been working with us for a long time. We're really happy with his work in that facility. One of the ways we found him was trying to find a certified organic processor. Since we are certified organic, in order to be able to maintain that sticker and that identity all the way through, we have to go to a processor who's willing to maintain that. He gets inspected as a handler, I guess you could say. And so he has his processes down, cleaning processes, whatever is required to maintain a certification. And he's been willing to work with us and maintain that for a number of years. And so we really appreciate him for that. The difficulties with processors, over the years, we've been to many different processors. Ultimately it's consistency of product and packaging. So the customer is used to or familiar with, it's consistent. Unfortunately, in the big picture grand scheme of things, Jerome's products have been fairly consistent or really consistent over the years. As he has turnover in his staff every once in a while, something will come back a little bit different than it was the week before. That's always, frustrating when, your turkey legs are sticking out instead of tucked under, or, something significant can be unappealing. There's been times where that's happened and he's actually taken it back and repackaged it for us. So, but overall, in the grand scheme of things, by sticking with one processor for a long time, it's generally, you can count on this month's packages are going to look like last month's. And he's also worked on labeling and several different items for us. And so we spend, if you think about a cow, basically from when you're deciding your breeding plan, it's a 3-year process nearly, from like thinking about who you're breeding the cow to taking that animal to the butcher and getting the steaks back to sell. So it's frustrating if the processor doesn't have the same commitment that you've had, and they can do some damage at the end. So it's fortunate that we found a good one to work with, because there's a lot of responsibility there, and the last few hours can change years worth of work and planning. Package size, we do a lot of our steaks are roughly an inch and a quarter, inch and a half. Roast are generally 2 pounds, 3 pounds. 4 is pretty big because we're looking at package size, but we're also looking at price point and total price point, so we don't want to have too big of cuts. We do a little bit of bone in, but very little. For the most part, it's boneless. And then we do several different sausages and different ground products. So we have like 3 or 4 ground beef, leaner, fatter, ancestral blend. So there's 3 or 4 different ground beef, and then we have 4 or 5 different sausages as well. Any animal that doesn't grade choice goes to be a ground product. If we maintain the organic integrity or status of our cow, cull cows can go to the organic or to the ground products. And so we do try to maintain a lot of uses for ground beef. I think that's it.
Do you have any problems marketing ground beef?
No, really, we don't. Because, again, ground beef patties, and then several different sausages, summer and links. We have a lot of SKUs, so we're selling packages by the piece, and so that's a big. We've been building this up for a long time, and just each year we keep adding a new SKU and adding a new SKU, and so inventory, and that it's all a huge chore. Don't get me wrong, but that's the flip side is we have a bunch of different product lines to try to not let the ground beef back up.
So we get most of our cattle done through Memphis Meats in Memphis, Indiana, and we have worked with Trackside there in Henry County as well. A lot of times if we're doing like a value added type thing, will go through trackside, because they have the ability to do some of the other sausages and stuff like that that Memphis doesn't. And then when we were doing we started the ancestral a couple years ago, so it gives us a market for organ meat and different things like that as well. A lot of it is just kind of paying attention to inventory, what's selling, what's not selling. If you've got certain cuts that aren't selling, but you're selling ground beef, then maybe not get those and put that in ground. You just kind of have to figure all that out, and everybody's market's going to be a little bit different, and having those options of making patties versus just having bulk ground beef type stuff, as it can be different ways to move a product that's setting. I personally don't have a big hand in on the marketing through Foxhollow. I manage the production side of it. Our marketing person is sitting in the front row if you guys have any questions for her. She can get into a little bit more detail on a lot of that stuff. But yeah, Phoebe and I we do work together to try to figure out what we can do and different bounce ideas off each other and stuff to try to make sure that we don't have inventory stacking up. And that is one benefit to having the subscription boxes or the different box options that we have, is you can try to package together things that maybe aren't moving through the market and kind of get those moved through that way, which is a constantly evolving and changing process. There's not like one thing we can say, hey, this is going to fix all your inventory problems or whatever, because like I said, everybody's market's going to be slightly different.
All right. So we're coming close to the end of our session. I would like to make one comment on marketing. My good friend in North Carolina used to sell boxes of meat, and he would put the approximate proportion of the carcass in each box. And when somebody would complain about that, he would just simply say, "Don't talk to me, talk to the good Lord." So that's maybe a good way if you do have certain cuts left over. I'd like to go, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to go to the audience one more time and see if there's a question in the audience from someone that doesn't have a phone or can't use the app very well. All right, Greg.
So we know John's certified organic, so obviously you can't work, and I don't know about biodynamics, but what are your strategies, whether you actually use wormer or try to, do like with annuals, you might break it up, right? So anyways, just your overall strategies related to finishing animals and parasites.
Okay, so the question was about wormers and being certified organic, and how do you break that cycle, or whether you use a wormer or not?
So we don't blanketly deworm. Like, our sheep have never been dewormed or vaccinated. We bought that flock specifically to have that genetic resistance built into it. And I think in the last 10 years, I've maybe dewormed 5 beef cows. And that was on the trailer on the way somewhere else. We do it through the rotation, trying to give enough time for a lot of those internal parasites to go through their life cycle and not be able to be picked up by a new host, but also the use of forbs. We have a lot of different forbs, weeds, whatever you want to call them, that grow in different times of the year that can help with that. So coming out of the winter, when you get your spring flush, you'll have multiflora rose bushes and stuff like that are a high tannin plant. And we'll see some of the cows that we're looking at them and we're like, they could be they might have a little bit of worms going on, and they'll be the ones that are in the rose bush eating that soft, fresh growth off there. And then in the fall, if anything's picked stuff up, they have access to some trees, some oak trees and different things like that. We've got chicory and all these different forbs that are spaced out through the different growing season that we kind of help use that. And if something is falling behind genetic-wise, they're probably not going to breed back and stick around anyway. But like I said, I've had a jug of Sidectin for well over a decade, and it's not even halfway gone. So
I would say, it's a result of the benefit of a lot of acres. So we're rotating our cows to either benefit the livestock, to help finish the animal on a good diet, or to build soil. We're rotating for multiple reasons, and then a benefit of that, and having a lot of acres to rotate over is low parasite load, and then the rest of that would be culling the few that do have some type of issue, especially in terms of the mama cow side. And then on the sheep, they rotate on a smaller portion of the farm, basically for predator control. There's a corner of the farm where we graze the sheep. They're still in rotation. They just don't have as big of an area to cover. So with them, the parasite, trying to stay ahead or away from the parasites, is a bigger impetus for us to rotate the sheep. They're on a smaller footprint, therefore that rotation is more religious no matter what. Where on the cattle, it's more for other reasons, and low parasite is a side benefit, I would say, from that.
If we need to worm anything, we cull them. We've kind of had that same huge container of Cydectin, and if anybody needs it, they leave the farm. And then the sheep, we don't worm. We rotating them. I'm going to kind of try to answer one of these questions. Multi-species grazing. We keep our sheep with the cattle, and that helps a whole lot. And we use garlic in their mineral.
All right, so we've got less than 5 minutes left, and I wanted to finish things up and just ask the panel a question. If you could give someone that's just getting into this grass finishing business a piece of advice, or maybe tell them a mistake that you made along the way, what would that be that would be most beneficial to them?
Wow. That's a good question. I think when I look at new farmers now, one of the mistakes I see that they make is putting too much money into their livestock right off the bat, not really knowing what they're doing, and they may buy some super expensive South Poles or something like that, where they're not really looking at just great animals. They're looking at sort of a trend or a fad. I think, that's probably like really trying to get somebody with you to go look at your cattle, know what you're looking for, 2/3 body, 1/3 leg, and make sure that you're buying from somebody who's farming the way you want to farm. So if you're buying sheep and they're worming every month, and you want a parasite-resistant flock, that's not the place to buy. And also take advice from somebody who's farming the same way that you want to farm.
I guess I would, similar to that, I think my first advice would be you don't have to buy in. Use whatever's growing as your pasture, and use whatever livestock you have, and observe and go from there. And observe the animals that perform well, and then eat a steak out of them, and take notes on which ones you want to keep and build your herd or flock from. If you're going to spend money on anywhere, I would spend it on buying hay. Not because you're buying a feed source, you're supplementing your pasture, but you're also bringing in nutrients from outside the farm. It's like free fertilizer along with so that's the one thing that I would, instead of buying hay equipment, buy hay, at least starting out, and then don't buy, you can buy seed and rent a grain drill and improve stuff, but you don't really have to. You can change your pastures a whole lot by the way you graze it.
My biggest thing would probably be something that we're even still dealing with right now, is stock for the worst growing point of the year. So when you have the least available forage on your farm, whatever that farm can carry should be your maximum stock density. Most farms are overstocked, and we're one of them. We had 600 head running on 750 acres at one point in time, all the way from cows to finishers, and we've dialed that way back. And so that's been the big thing that we're doing. I'm rereading, kicking the hay habit and trying to tweak all of that. And it was kind of forced, bad stockpiling for 3 or 4 years in a row, and then, having to feed a lot more hay through the winter and stuff like that. So, spend your money wisely on getting good hay in, but then also don't be distracted by numbers and, a lot of cattle people, how many head you got? Like that's a status thing, how many head you're running. And it's like, I would much rather say I have enough cows that I don't have to feed them. I can graze year round. And I'm only having to carry hay for when we get 2 feet of snow or a bunch of ice kind of thing. So stock for your winter.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone for attending the session. I'm sorry if your question didn't get answered. I'm sure our speakers will be happy to talk to you after the session, but we're going to have to conclude the session. Let's thank our panelists for this wonderful session. All right, thank you.